Yeah, my strategy is going to be every time I say fuck, I'm going to whisper, so it doesn't pick me up. Okay. Any of you little bastards misbehave, I'll kill you. Yeah, no, it's going to change the whole dynamic of my teaching, actually. I'm already working on a tap dance routine. We're going to be on television. We're taking this to the bank, baby. We're going to have our own show by, I think, December. I can guarantee it. I'm talking with producers right now. All right. You know what? I think I made a little bit of a mistake here because you guys were not as far as this. We did talk about cockroaches and koalas, right?
That was the last thing we talked about.
That's the last thing I talked about. Did you have nightmares from that? Sort of Kafka-esque kind of nightmares about cockroaches and koala bears coming at you? Good. That was my goal. I have a number of goals in this class. One of them is that you be as miserable as me by the end of the semester. Another is that you simply become me, actually. My goal is that you will walk like me and talk like me and essentially be me by the end of the semester. And how effectively you do that will determine your grade. Okay, I thought I might as well be honest with you. All right, so we did do this. Did we get to this slide? Okay, so remember that last we talked about these two animals, and we focused a little while on the relationship between the koala bear and its food source, which is this eucalyptus tree here. I mentioned to you, I believe, that you theoretically could see the koala bear as a parasite on the eucalyptus tree. Did I say this to you? Not remember. Okay, it was. I teach two classes back to back. I do exactly the same lecture, although it's not exactly the same. And sometimes when I deviate from the script and say something, I don't remember which one of you it was with. I should probably take notes. Maybe I'll use this to keep it straight. Yes, you could theoretically look at something like a koala bear's habitual feeding on eucalyptus as a kind of parasitism, right? What is parasitism? What does that mean? What's the difference between a parasite and a predator? That's a good way to think of it.
A parasite lives off of a host at the expense of the host itself, but
it doesn't kill it. What's your name again? Andrew. Okay, we should probably get a microphone for Andrew because he answers all the questions, which I'm very appreciative of. I'm not attacking you. What I'm doing is trying to encourage some of these other losers to actually participate in class. Okay. Yes, that's right. Okay, so the difference is that a predator, of course, is going to kill its prey, right? A parasite will allow its host to continue living but feed off of it. Humans, we do both of these things, but we're arguably more predators than parasites, which might be why we're intolerant of parasites. Some things parasitize us, actually, such as cockroaches, right? So we don't like that. But the relationship between those two species, to call it parasitism, is to give it a certain kind of dynamic, right? A parasitic relationship has a certain kind of dynamic, and that is that one creature benefits, the other is harmed but not killed, okay? Or there's some cost to the creature. Okay. That is one type of coevolutionary relationship, okay? So coevolutionary relationships involve the evolution of two interdependent species, each of which adapts to the other. A good example of this, of course, is shown here with flowers and their pollinators. Okay. Who benefits in this arrangement shown in the photo? Both of them benefit. Okay. The word that you've probably heard for a relationship between species where both benefit is what? Symbiotic or symbiosis. Okay. This is a symbiotic relationship between the two of them. And in fact, we also call a relationship where both partners in the arrangement benefit mutualism, because they both mutually benefit. Okay, that's a little bit different than parasitism, where only one of them is benefiting and the other one is harmed. Okay, so these are different types of relationships between species. Now, pollinators and flowers are quite interesting. What's happening here? Who's benefiting? What's going on? Should we give somebody else a chance, and then I'll fall back on you? Please don't take offense. I actually have no problem with people consistently answering yes.
And then I'm kind of taking a step back. The bee is pollinating the flower.
The bee is pollinating the flower. What does that mean? It's what is it spreading?
The pollen.
What is pollen?
The seeds or the, I don't know,
What is pollen?
the spread.
It makes me sneeze. I know that. What is pollen? Pollen is like sex cells, right? We call them gametes, are the fancy term for this. Do I have a pen? The definition of gametes is sex cells, or if you want to think of it that way, sperm and eggs, or not to be confused with ham and eggs. Don't confuse those two things. So gametes are sex cells, and that's what pollen is, right? So basically, what you're looking at here is sort of like pornography, really. Like this bee is smearing itself with sex cells as it crawls all over this flower. And the flower has evolved so this will happen, right? So what's in it for the bee? Let's get to that part of the question, and then we can go on. Yeah. Nectar is the bee's little reward. And in fact, it's sort of like management and labor, right? Some people say that the pollinators are slaves of the flowers, but basically they provide the labor, because what can't the flower do? Move around. Plants have this challenge with reproducing because they can't move easily. So they have a couple of options. Pollinators as a workforce is a very effective one, and many, many plants utilize different pollinators, which include not just insects, but what else? What other groups of organisms pollinate besides insects? Birds and even primates do this. Okay, you'll see some examples in the class. Primates are pollinators too. Especially smaller ones, because really, if you think about it, a large animal is not going to be a pollinator. Why? Crush the flower, but the reward isn't great enough for me to take my time. I need more nutrition. I mean, think of how many flowers I'd have to do this for in order to get the nutrition I need. Waste of time. Okay? So it's small creatures, small primates, some others too, but small primates, birds, insects, and so forth. So the coevolution that's happened here is that flowers have preferred pollinators, actually, and those flowers send signals to those pollinators. So, for example, you know, some pollinators identify flowers based on sight. Some of those pollinators have the ability to see in color, which is why, say, a hummingbird likes red. Okay? Others don't see in color, but they still visually identify the flowers that they're going to pollinate or drink nectar from, is what they're interested in, right? And they do it visually even though they don't have color vision. What do? Well, they're flying along and they look down and, oh my gosh, look, there's a little bullseye down there, right? A little bullseye that says, come to me, right? And if you think about how many flowers have, you know, this sort of color contrast, or this kind of contrast in tone, really, where it doesn't matter what the color of the flower is, but you've got this sort of outer contrast with a darker center, right? So you don't even need to see in color to identify this as a target, right? Still, other flowers, of course, will draw their pollinators through sense of smell. All of the ones that do this, of course, only appeal to certain pollinators. So some pollinators have no sense of smell at all, and it doesn't matter if the flower smells. Okay? Flowers have multiple pollinators and may advertise in all of these ways. It just depends. Some are highly specialized. Now we're back to specialized versus generalized. Some flowers literally only have a single pollinator. Okay? If you think about it, it's in the interest of the flower to have a pollinator that isn't too much of a slut, really, because if the pollinator goes to every flower in the universe, that doesn't help you sexually, because what you need is a member of your own species. So the more specialized it is, the better it is for your reproduction. If the creature goes to everything, then you're going to get all kinds of the wrong pollen, which is you're not going to reproduce. You want pollen from your own species. That's what you're looking for. So for the flowers, greater specialization by pollinators is ultimately something that will benefit them. And this is one of the reasons why flowers have evolved these very elaborate structures, because they specifically appealed to a small number, if not only a single species of pollinator. Okay. Now, if you think about it, in the pollinator's interest is going to be in just getting nectar, which is the little reward, the sweet reward, right? So the pollinator is going to want every flower it can lay its tongue on, basically, but the flower is going to make that hard because it's in its interest to have a single specific or small number of pollinators. So even though it's a cooperative, mutualistic relationship, there's still bargaining going on over evolutionary time here. In Darwin's day, there was a well-known orchid. Darwin wrote several books on orchids. They were one of his interests within the natural world. And there was a well-known orchid from Madagascar that, and I should get a picture for you as part of this lecture, but which stores its nectar at the end of, it looks like this. Let me draw it. It's better than using my hands. It looks like this, right? So it's down here is where the nectar is. Up here, right, is where the pollen is. And this is how it is with flowers. They're always designed, because it benefits them, to where the pollinator has to come in contact with the pollen in order to get the nectar, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't prove any benefit to the flower. So the nectar is always sort of hard to get to. Well, in Darwin's day, there was an orchid from Madagascar that was known to have, a 12-inch length, right? And at the base of the orchid, the nectar was stored. Well, no one knew what the pollinator was for this particular flower, but Darwin predicted, of course, that eventually someone would discover a moth with a very long tongue. And that's and he basically said, look, this is going to show up, I can guarantee you. And sure enough, several decades later, it ended up getting discovered, and we now know that pollinator goes with this flower. Good example of a high degree of a specialization. Nothing else can really do this. But that moth, man, he's got it made. He's like the koala bear, right? Every time he finds an orchid, it's all his. Nobody else can actually do this except for him, right? So you get these kinds of specialized relationships. Okay, it's a good example of a cooperative relationship. Flowering is one of the main ways that plants will reproduce. It's not the only one. You can send your seeds or your pollen or whatever it is off into the air, and it can be transported by the wind. They call this aeolian transport, meaning by the wind. But flowering is a really, really common strategy for plants. And that doesn't mean they don't use both methods. Some flowers use both methods. They send pollen into the air, and they have pollinators. Why not? But this is a very common situation here. Yes, sir.
So does symbiosis usually occur with these kind of specialized adaptations?
Yes. And the interesting thing is that insects predate flowering plants paleontologically. Flowering plants show up, last numbers I read, and I'm a little bit bad with numbers, so you can jump on the web with this, but I believe flowering plants began becoming much more common about 125 million years ago. Insects predate that by a long shot. So what happens is you get the evolution of flowering plants. There's this already in existence group of organisms that make very good pollinators, and that leads to the explosion of flowering plants. But flowering as a strategy for reproduction does not go back as far as plants themselves do. It comes along later from the evidence that we have currently. Okay, but yeah, these two things, they call this mutualism because they've mutually affected each other's evolution over long periods of time. Okay, now let's look at a couple of coevolutionary relationships in more detail. It'll help you kind of understand. The thing about evolutionary science that's really tricky or understanding like ecosystems is that there are so many factors that come into play, it's sometimes difficult to pin it down to one thing, right? So if you're trying to think of like, okay, well, what caused such and such to evolve, right? Like this kind of question, some trait. A classic example is, what caused, you know, humans to evolve walking on two legs? I mean, after all, virtually no other primate does this. It's very unusual. Okay, so what you want to think to yourself is, okay, there's some cost involved in this. What kind of anatomical changes are required for this to come about, but also what kind of rewards would actually lead that to evolve, right? Otherwise, we'd be walking on all fours. There's got to be something better about this. What's better about it? Well, it turns out that there's a whole lot of things that come into play. It's not just one thing. It's not like, oh, well, you can run farther, which you can. You can expend less energy running farther. That's one thing. But that's not the only factor that led it to evolve. So in other words, the thing about evolutionary scenarios is that they are typically not monocausal. They are multi-causal, meaning that they have multiple causes. Okay, and the whole thing can get phenomenally complicated. And when you start looking at coevolution, in other words, how species influence one another, you realize this quite quickly. I mean, I can isolate cases of two species in their relationship to one another and talk about them, but the reality of the flower and the bee is that they both interact with many different species in their everyday life. And that means the whole picture is very, very complicated. We've only just sort of started understanding individual species and their evolution over time. Understanding the relationships between 2 or 3 or more species is something that makes environmental science, right, and the study of ecosystems very, very difficult, actually. So that's one, the whole coevolutionary relationship between species is one area of this particular branch of science that really has a long way to go. But let me just give you some scenarios because it'll help you understand at least a little bit about how complex this whole thing actually is. There it is. I always do this. All right. So coevolution. Now, one coevolutionary relationship that we've already talked about is competition. Okay. Now, in the last slide, I was talking about coevolution between species, but it turns out that lots and lots of influences exist. Okay. Some of them come from within your own species. Competition is the main driving force behind the evolution of species. It's not the only one. Some species cooperate too, and that plays a role. We'll talk about cooperation, but first we'll talk about the dark and the ugly. And then we'll move on to cooperation, which people tend to like more. There are two forms of cooperation: interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. There are two prefixes that sound a lot alike that mean different things. What do they mean? What's inter? Inter is different. It's between. Inter, I-N-T-E-R, is between. Intra is within. Okay? So that would mean that intraspecific competition refers to competition that occurs within the same species. Inter, between species. Okay? The koala bear and the eucalyptus are in competition with one another. That's interspecific, between species. These kangaroos are fighting with each other. That's intraspecific, between kangaroos, or within the kangaroo group. Now, which of these do you think is the most important in evolution most typically? Inter? How many people say inter? Don't worry, you won't be harmed for answering it incorrectly. How many people say intra? The answer is intra, particularly with social species. Okay? Let's come up with a hypothetical scenario here. Your name again? Lizette. Lizette and Andrew, having sat next to each other in this class all semester and suffering through my horrible, evil tests and everything else, these dreadful lectures that go on and on and on, the scandals that arise from the televising of these lectures, suffer together and form a bond. Eventually they start studying together for exams and they fall in love. I actually have had several students fall in love in my classes. I've had 3 sets of students get married after meeting in my class. I went to 2 of the weddings. It was fun. They both got divorced like 10 minutes later, but it was cool. One couple had a kid, and I had one girl have a kid that named her kid after something in my class. Not Darwin, not this class. Although I also had a kid named Darwin. Okay, so anyway, that's a side note. They fall in love.
What'd you name it?
Erzli, which is the name of one of the deities in Haitian voodoo, and I teach about it in my religion class. Yeah, magic, witchcraft, and religion. Man, that's a racy class. You got to take that. Lots of fun in there. Yeah, Erzli. She's like the patron saint of Haiti, basically. She's like the Black Madonna, basically, because she's similar to Christianity, Black Madonna. All right, anyway, side note, nothing to do with anything. They fall in love. They decide to go camping together. Okay? While they're camping, a terrible tragedy strikes, and a bear shows up, right, and begins to chase them and eat them. Lisette doesn't actually have to outrun the bear. She only has to outrun Andrew, and then he gets eaten by the bear. Okay, so even in a case where you've got something like predation, which seems like a fairly straightforward example of interspecific competition, right, you still have competition between species coming into play if that species is social, like we are, like gazelles are, like anything that lives in a group. By social, we mean anything that lives in groups. Okay, that's what I mean by a social species. Okay, so the answer really is intra. You're competing with members of your own species for food and mates, and that's a biggie. Those are big. Okay, now if you're a predator, you're competing with your prey, and that's important too. Predator-prey relationships are good examples of strong interspecific competition. Okay, here's a good one. This is a cheetah chasing its primary prey item, which is a Thompson's gazelle. And the cheetah, as most people know, is famous for what? It's the fastest animal on land on Earth. Okay? And the Thompson's gazelle, not surprisingly, not coincidentally, as the cheetah's main prey item, no, is the second fastest. Yeah, the slowest. Yeah, it's at a terrible disadvantage. Until they invented the automobile, they had no chance at all. So basically what you've got here is kind of an evolutionary arms race where the two species have driven each other to get faster and faster. The main difference actually is, and this isn't surprising since they're predator and prey, that the cheetah, which is an ambush predator that stalks its prey, stealth predator, sneaks up on them and ambushes them, can put on a very quick burst of speed, but it runs out of energy. They actually literally overheat and have to stop running. The gazelle isn't as fast overall, but can outlast the cheetah, and if it can just stay out of their range long enough, will get away. So the gazelle, not surprisingly, has eyes on the side of its head to see if prey is approaching. The cheetah, like most predators, has eyes on the front of its head, so it can keep itself focused on its target. Okay, what does that say about people? Well, I think you're a little bit more cheetah-like than gazelle-like, but I'm just saying. So, interestingly, this seems to be a case where this particular relationship is so critical that it's driven this excessive speed. We have all kinds of examples like this in nature. The most poisonous creatures in nature are typically predated by something that has a high degree of tolerance for the poison, right? One of the most poisonous creature in North America is a newt, which secretes enough poison in its skin to kill 30 people. It's about 3.5 inches long. And there's a famous legend in the old Northwest about 3 fishermen going out and camping, and they were all found dead in their cabin, lying on the ground dead. And they couldn't figure out what killed them until they finally found a newt in the coffee pot that they were drinking from. I think it's a true story. I'm not really positive. But this particular newt has the power to kill people quite easily. We have no resistance towards poison. Now, its primary predator is some form of garter snake. And the snake can eat one, but it's sort of like it's taken a couple of sleeping pills after it's eaten it. You know, it's like this. And then it kind of like lies down and goes to sleep for a while. And that means it's a disadvantage for that snake to eat it. It can survive, but it becomes more vulnerable to its own predators. So it's all a big arms race, right? Similar thing to, if you've ever watched that sort of funny honey badger video on YouTube. Have you ever seen this one?
That's so funny.
The first time I saw that, I laughed my ass off.
It is so funny. My friend showed me the video, and he was talking it up so much, and then he played it, and I was literally like on the floor.
Yeah, it's so funny. Do you guys want to watch it right now? You want to watch it? Okay, I need to get the speakers out. It takes like it's like 2 minutes. It's just stupid.
Is it this voiceover one or something, or what is it?
Yeah, I don't know.
No, I was just thinking if you hadn't seen it, I was going to send it to you.
Well, like when I was talking about the newt, did you think about it? Yeah, because the honey badger has the same. Yeah, it's it can handle the bite of a cobra, but when it gets bitten, it falls asleep for a while. All right, it's the same sort of thing. All right. Everyone's going to be really. We're hyping this up too much. They're all going to suffer from disappointment. Let's see if it works. Sometimes oh wait, YouTube. What is this? Why is this acting weird? No, yes, that wouldn't be found. How did I do that? Okay. Here it is.
This is the honey badger. This is the honey badger. Watch it run in slow motion. It's pretty badass. Look, it runs all over the place. Whoa, watch out, said that bird. Ew, it's got a snake. Oh, it's chasing a jackal. Oh my gosh. Oh, the honey badgers are just crazy. The honey badger has been referred to by the Guinness Book of World Records as the most fearless animal in all the animal kingdom. It really doesn't give a shit. Look, it's hungry. It's hungry. Ew, what's that in its mouth? Oh, it's got a cobra. Oh, it runs backwards. Now watch this. Look, the snake's up in the tree. Honey badger don't care. Honey badger don't give a shit. It just takes what it wants. Whenever it's hungry, it just, ew, and it eats snakes. Oh my god, watch it dig. Look at that digging. The honey badger is really pretty badass. They have no regard for any other animal whatsoever. Look, it's just grunting and ew, eating snakes. Ew, what's that, a mouse? Oh, that's nasty. Oh, they're so nasty. Oh, look, it's chasing things and eating them. The honey badgers have a fairly long body, but a distinctly thick set, broad shoulders, and, you know, their skin is loose, allowing them to move about freely, and they twist around. Now look, here's a house full of bees. You think the honey badger cares? It doesn't give a shit. It goes right into the house of bees to get some larvae. How disgusting is that? It eats larvae. Ew, it's so nasty. But look, the honey badger doesn't care. It's getting stung like 1,000 times. It doesn't give a shit. It's hungry. It doesn't care about being stung by bees. Nothing can stop the honey badger when it's hungry. Oh, what a crazy fuck. Look. Ew, it's eating larvae. That's disgusting. There it is, running in slow motion again. See? Now, what's interesting is that other animals like these birds here, they just like to wait around until the honey badger's done eating and then swoops in to pick up the scraps. It says, you do all the work for us, honey badger, and we'll just eat whatever you find. How's that? What do you say, stupid? Look at this bird. Thanks for the treat, stupid. Hey, come back here, says the honey badger. Birds don't care. And you know what? The jackals do it too. Look at these little dogs. They're like, thanks, stupid. Thanks for the mouse. See you later. The honey badger does all the work while these other animals just pick up the scraps. At nighttime, the honey badger goes hunting because it's hungry. Look, here comes a fierce battle between a king cobra and a honey badger. I wonder what'll happen. Look at this. There's the honey badger just eating a mouse. And then what? Get away from me, said the snake. Get away from me. Honey badger don't care. Honey badger smacks the shit out of it. The snake comes back and it lashes right at the honey badger. Oh, little does the honey badger know, FYI, it's been stung. It's been bitten by the snake, so while it's eating the snake, Ew, that's disgusting. Meanwhile, the poisonous venom is seeping through the honey badger's body, and it passes out. Oh, that sleepy fuck. Now, the honey badger's just going to pass out for a few minutes, and then it's going to get right back up and start eating all over again, because it's a hungry little bastard. Look at this. Like nothing happened. The honey badger gets right back up and continues eating the cobra. How disgusting. And of course, what does the honey badger have to eat for the next 2 weeks? Cobra, the honey badger.
All right. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them. That's the funny one, though. Okay. That is a good example of what I'm talking about with, like, predatory races between organisms, which you find in a lot of different ways. Poison is one, speed is another. Okay, predator, animal that hunts or kills other organisms for food. Oh, incidentally, do you know what the fastest creature in North America is? Land. Let's stick to land. Squirrel. Squirrel, you can't catch one, right? So that's fast. No?
Squirrel shot out of a potato ball.
Nice. It's what's called a pronghorn antelope. It's quite fast. They run really quickly. They used to be found all the way from Canada down to the southwest. They're still all around, but they've been kind of hunted a lot. One time when I was driving in Arizona, they were running. I was on the highway going 45 or 50 miles an hour, and they were running alongside of my car. It was really trippy. And I was like sitting there driving along with them, and I slowed down a little bit, but they just kept running with me. And then finally, I must have been going probably between about 40 and 45. There was like 3 of them, and they just took off and ran in front of my car and went past me as I was driving. It was crazy. Now, they have no predator that exists today. There's nothing that can catch them except an idiot with a gun. So they're natural predators. I mean, you would make the prediction, like Darwin did with the moth, that there's another predator. There's a predator for this creature that must have driven it to get so fast that is no longer in existence, right? And sure enough, I mean, eventually, if fossils of something you might call, I don't know, the North American cheetah, they're different than cheetahs, but a cat that's quick, were actually dug up, and this does seem to be what the relationship between them was, much like the model with the cheetah and the Thompson's gazelle. You're in a good place, though, when your predator disappears.
So would they get slower over time?
You know, what would happen would be if, you know, what happens to that? What happens to a trait you don't need, right? Because we have examples of birds colonizing islands where they have no predators, and they cease being migratory, and they just stay on the island. They have no predators, so, you know, they don't fly much, right? Or bats in some places have done the same thing. They just barely can still fly. Basically, it's a trade-off. So it requires nutrients for you to develop this trait, okay? If that's too demanding, given the available resources, the trait should diminish over time. Like you'd lose your ability to fly, not immediately, perhaps, with one genetic mutation or something, but rather over time, slowly. So in theory, they perhaps are getting slower and slower because it's no longer necessary to be as fast, right? Pity we can't actually measure that, because it's a good hypothesis that they would. And this would take a long time, right? And there could be other advantages to their ability to be quick as well, in terms of migration or something like this, right? So, but yeah, theoretically, yeah, that's a good guess. Yeah.
Have there been examples of maybe like an animal like that you know, once there was no predator, is there a species that became a predator that was formerly not?
Well, no, because if their resource needs are already met by something, that would be a radical change. You know, another good example that's similar to this is the buffalo. All of the predators of buffalo died off 10,000 years ago, and that's why the buffalo population in North America exploded to about 60 million by the time, you know, white people colonized North America, and then we sort of wiped a lot of them out. But the buffalo had no predators, and they eat grass. I mean, talk about a magic formula for increasing your numbers. You've got this really readily available food source, and nothing can eat you, right? So the numbers get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. is the buffalo going to turn into, you know, a lion or something? That would require very radical changes, and there's not a strong, we call it a selection pressure when something is pushing evolution in a certain direction. Okay, so in this case, there's a strong selection pressure on this gazelle as prey for a quick cat to be faster. And by selection pressure, we mean that natural selection will favor the fastest animals that are to survive, right? Who's going to get eaten? Well, the slow losers, and the fast ones are going to survive and reproduce successfully, right? And the ones that survive and reproduce successfully are also going to be successful if their babies pop out pretty quick, because one thing predators do is actually feed on vulnerable members of herds, right? So they go after young sometimes. So, you know, they're pretty fast out of the womb, right? Not like people. We don't have this selection pressure. But you can say there's a pressure on this species to be faster and faster, driven by this cheetah, right? There's no selection pressure on something that's an herbivore that has plenty of grass to eat to become a predator because, hey, everything is pretty damn good as it is. Plus, it would require sort of rather massive anatomical changes, which makes it unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely. Yeah, and that's sort of a nutshell answer to your question. Herbivores are sometimes referred to as plant predators, but as we saw in the case of the koala bear, it might be more accurate if they don't actually kill what they're eating to call them plant parasites. Okay? Now, predators in the wild get organized into hierarchies, and these are called food chains. Sorry, we'll go back here. I thought there was one more bullet point. It's actually more appropriate to call them food webs than food chains, but both concepts are actually useful. So you would look at this image here and say, oh, the cheetah is higher on the food chain than the gazelle, right? There are other things that are below the gazelle, the grass, okay? Food chains and food webs make up what are called the trophic structure, which just means like the feeding structure. And they work in basically the same way. This image, which you can probably barely see, gives you two examples. One's terrestrial here on the left, and the other one's marine here. So among terrestrials, the food chain works like this. You've got plants. You have herbivores that eat the plants as a grasshopper on a flower. Then you've got primary level carnivores, okay, which they refer here to as secondary consumers. A mouse eats the grasshopper, okay? Then you have another carnivore, third level, eats the mouse, okay? And then finally, a top predator, in this case a red-tailed hawk, eats the snake, okay? Over here, the basis of the food chain isn't going to be plants, but it's going to be phytoplankton. And the thing that phytoplankton and plants have in common is that they both derive their energy directly from the sun. Okay, so they're the basis of the food chain. Everything feeds off of them in a succession. Zooplankton eats phytoplankton, small fish eat zooplankton, bigger fish eat small fish, and then finally some top-level carnivore, like here an orca, will eat those bigger fish. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that no matter how many species you have, no matter how much biodiversity you have, you're in the Amazon, you're on a tropical reef, doesn't matter how many species you've got, the food chain generally is 5 links or fewer. That means that an increase in the number of species does not make the food chain longer vertically. It just means that you've got more individual species at each of these levels. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So you can make some predictions, right? That the number of species at each of these levels, of all the levels, what level is going to have the most species and what's going to have the least? The top are going to be which? The fewest. Yeah, that's how it works. So the farther you go up, the fewer species that there are going to be. And in fact, if you're an environmental scientist and you really want to know, for example, whether human beings have had a damaging impact on rainforests in northern Thailand, you will go to that environment and you will count the number of top predators. Because what happens is, if there has been a negative human impact on the environment, the effect gets felt most at the top, kind of like in an earthquake, the way the top of the building sways more, because everything that happens down here has a trickle-up effect, and this is dependent on this whole structure for its existence. So if this gets messed up, this is the first thing that suffers, because top predators are smaller in number, and that means smaller in number of species, but also that those species that you find at the top level just aren't that numerous, right? There's trillions of phytoplankton, but there aren't that many orcas, right? If that makes sense to you. There's not that many species up here, and those that exist up there are just not that numerous because they're dependent on everything below them, okay? In other words, there's kind of a pattern of diminishing returns as you go up the food chain. Okay. Now the reason we call it a food web is, again, that there are multiple species at each level, greater numbers at the bottom than the top, and multiple species at each level. And that means if something happens to one of them, let's say something gets wiped out for whatever reason, its place will be taken by another consumer that's at the same level as it. Will kind of move into its niche, move into its space. Okay. And that's why it's more like a web than a chain. The chain is like a piece of the web, basically, is the way to conceptualize it spatially. Okay? So the relationships are predictable. The top carnivores are always big in size and small in number. Of course, they're bigger as well. I didn't mention that, but of course they're going to be larger in size. The number of links does not increase as the community size increases, as we said. If the chain is broken, the ecosystem remains intact because the species are linked in a food web. Okay? It stays intact up to a point. Some species are more difficult to replace than others. The ones at the top are the most difficult to replace. And of course, the thing about the ones at the top is that, as predators, they hold the populations of those lower levels in check, right? So interesting things happen in nature. If it rains a lot one year in the northwest coast forests in North America, the population of mice explodes because their food source grows much better. The population of mice explodes. That leads the population of owls to explode because there's more mice to go around. But you then have this problem where once the population has exploded, if the food source doesn't continue, there's going to be a crash and populations are going to fluctuate. So the next year's dry, there's fewer acorns, less mice, less owls. So everything kind of fluctuates in that way. But predators will hold prey and hold numbers of their prey in check. And that literally does happen. I mean, this is one of the consequences of the reintroduction of wolf populations in North America, for example, that their prey items, which include deer, are now on the decline because the wolf is a factor in their ecosystem again. Right? So people are there's a big argument about whether reintroducing wolves was a good idea. I mean, it does return the ecosystem to its original state, but it's going to have impacts because anytime you do something like that, there's a ripple effect, like a ripple in a pond, right? Some species are especially important, and those get referred to as keystone species. A keystone was the stone that was used in the middle of a doorway arch in old stone structures that held the rest of the stones in place for the arch. I can give you a good example of this in detail, which you don't need to write down, but you can just remember that this is a keystone species. And that is the adorable California sea otter shown here in this image. They're found from California to Alaska. They were hunted for fur to near extinction. You don't need to write this down. Just remember that the otter is a keystone species. They're hunted for fur to near extinction by the late 19th century. Their disappearance leads to an explosion in the populations of a creature called a sea urchin. You've probably heard of these, right? Okay, how many people have eaten one? Ew. Nice. What'd you think? Is it uni? You're an uni fan? To me, they're like weird tongues. Do you like them too? You're into them? Yeah, I like them too. They're okay. I'm not crazy about them, but it's cool. There's a big industry, actually, in exporting uni to Japan from the coast of California because they proliferate here, partly because we've wiped out their primary predator. Sea urchins are sort of famous. They're these little ball-like creatures that have spikes on them. When I worked at the fish store, I used to have to service people's aquariums, and one day when I was being careless, I just like crashed into one with my hand, and all the spikes came off in my hand. It was quite lovely. They were very difficult to get out of my skin, and my hand swelled up to about twice its normal size. That wasn't as bad as getting bit by the moray eel, but that's another story. So, the urchin population explodes without its primary predator thanks to people hunting them. There was a big craze in Europe for fur-lined gloves and hats and coats, and the California sea otter is famous for a couple of things. One of the things it's famous for is that it has the densest fur of any animal on Earth. Okay? Densest fur of any animal on Earth, which is how it managed to sort of float around and dry out so easily. Sea urchins then turn around and decimate the kelp forest, okay, which causes huge problems on the coast of this continent, because a lot of things depend on the kelp forest for survival and reproduction. Okay, so it's a good example of the kind of domino effect that you have when these kinds of systems are disrupted. Crustaceans, squid, and fish that depend on it for protection follow, they decline, then their predators decline because their predators depend on them. It's a whole system of contingencies, essentially, right? Zooplankton numbers ultimately drop, as do species that feed on zooplankton, and even whales, which feed on them, start searching for food elsewhere. And basically the result here is that due to the European desire to have fur-lined gloves, whale migration patterns get changed, ultimately. And that's because of this domino effect, right? It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. So that's a good example of a keystone species. Of course, you can argue it. You know, we get rid of the otter, the whole thing falls apart. But, you know, you could also say, well, it's really the kelp forest that's the keystone species. But, you know, basically the idea here is that by removing something in these webs, you can cause the whole web to collapse in theory. You're not always safe eliminating a species. It doesn't always just get replaced by something else. The reason why the otter led to the collapse is because it's high on the food chain and couldn't be easily replaced, right? So that was the problem there. We have a good example of how it works. All right, let's get back to parasitism, one of my favorite topics. Here's a wonderful parasitic relationship that we find commonly in nature, and that's birds laying their eggs in the nests of other birds and forcing the parenting duties for their offspring on others. The cuckoo bird is famous for this, so are the cowbirds. There's about 40 or so species between the two groups, and they lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. So the cuckoo bird is the baby. Its foster parent is the sedge warbler, who is unable to deduce that it's not their own baby. The eggs look like the sedge warbler's eggs. They mimic the eggs. They can't tell them apart. And then when the baby's born, which actually it develops faster than the babies of the sedge warbler, it will push the eggs of the parents out of the nest, and they fall to their death. This is an advantage, of course, because the parasitic cuckoo bird then gets to monopolize all the food that the parents are bringing. It grows at this alarming rate, ultimately gets so large that it's much bigger than its parents. Meanwhile, its own parents, who have parasitized the nest of the other bird, are, I don't know, off vacationing in Florida or Vegas or something, right? Saves you a lot of effort. You can see the appeal of parasitism as a strategy. It's really important. You feed off the resources of something else, saves you a lot of effort, right? We have people like this in human society as well. So, what is parasitism? It's a non-cooperative form of coevolution. One benefits, the other is harmed, as we said. The parasite lives off the tissues or efforts of the host, and it differs from predation because the host is kept alive. Predators kill and consume their prey. Okay. You yourself are a host to numerous parasites. You're probably crawling with them. Some of them are beneficial. You've got some stomach bacteria you really need. Other things live on your skin, happily devouring your wasted resources and dead skin cells. It's estimated that approximately 1/2 or more of all American adults have at the base of their eyelashes a parasitic mite that lives, that's so tiny you can't see it. It feeds off of the dead skin cells. Mascara won't kill them, so don't think that you're immune, ladies. And they're down there right now, baby. They're clinging on. They're having a little party. You can, if you just listen hard enough, you can almost hear the conga drum. It's beautiful. Think of them as pets. It's funny, pets are actually parasites too, but we like them, right? Because they bring us joy. But the next time you're feeling lonely, just think of your little friends at the base of your eyelashes. Oh my God, okay. Now, oh, go back too much. Wait, there you go. You've got some other parasites. We try to rid ourselves of parasites. In fact, they do pose threats to your health, right? Because they're, yeah, it's interesting. You know, there are chains of parasitism too, right? So you have, you know, in the next slide I'm going to show you vampire bat. Vampire bats carry rabies to their hosts and perpetuate viruses. So oftentimes parasites will actually carry other parasites with them, and then those parasites will attack the host as well. They become vectors for this kind of arrangement. Okay. Okay, here's vampire bats. Now, we're talking about all these kind of nasty, terrible relationships, cooperation, parasitism. You're probably thinking nature's a really awful place. So let me tell you that actually what you also find in the natural world, particularly among social species, is cooperation. Two examples of these are vampire bats and penguins. Okay, we're continuing on our cute, fuzzy versus hated dichotomy here with the two different species. Generally speaking, of course, people love penguins. How many people saw March of the Penguins? Raise your hand up high. Why aren't you proud? It's okay. I'm not going to attack you. Okay. Yeah, March of the Penguins. You know the story about March of the Penguins? March of the Penguins started out in France being a movie that had a voiceover. So every penguin in March of the Penguins had a character, and they all talked to each other like an animated film, except it wasn't. It was real footage. The French loved this. They showed it to Americans. They all thought it was the stupidest thing in the world. They hated it. So they recorded the voiceover with Morgan Freeman and turned it into a documentary, and it was wildly successful, made several $100 million. Yeah, they used to have stupid little voices and be characters. Yeah. So, shows you the advantage of test audiences. One of the more popular nature documentaries in the history of film. Everyone loves penguins, caused a massive penguin craze. Many other films followed. The vampire bat, however, has had no such success, and I, myself, am planning on championing them. I tried to sell Disney on my movie about vampire bats, and they didn't buy it. I don't understand why, but perhaps because they're not cute and fuzzy and people don't love them. But I'm certain that the right Disney movie could resurrect them from being hated and vilified to being as popular as any goddamn penguin. They're both cooperative. I'll get to vampire bats. Those of you who saw March of the Penguins, what do the penguins do that represents cooperation? What happens in that movie, remember?
The male and female penguin.
Male and female penguin.
They work to take care of the egg while she goes back to get food.
They work to take care of the egg. So the males warm the egg while the female's off going to get food. Okay? Now they're cooperating to raise offspring, which makes sense because that's increasing both of their fitness. But they also cooperate in a way that isn't between parents. It's just between members of the group. Do you remember?
They all huddle together.
They all huddle together for warmth, and because it's so cold, right, in Antarctica, where they reproduce, that if they don't, they'll die. Moreover, they have to do what while they're huddled together? Do you remember? They have to rotate, so you can never be on the outside of the huddle for too long or you'll freeze to death. So you have to take turns being on the inside. And you have to rotate. You're on the inside for a while, then you go out to the outside. And the whole huddle is constantly moving in this way, right? Now, you can think of it this way. If they were all competing with one another, if there was no cooperative principle operating between the members of the species, then everybody would try to be in the middle. It would be like some sort of penguin riot, right? And those who lost would die, but then so ultimately would the group as a whole, because everybody on the outside would continue dying, right? So what you can see from this is that they engage in a cooperative behavior with each other, and not just to improve the fitness of themselves and their spouse or their mate, as they would with taking care of the egg, but they take care of other members of the group that aren't necessarily closely related to them, right? So you don't have a strong interest in helping those people. They're not your relatives. But without that kind of cooperative behavior, you wouldn't survive, which is what I mean by they're highly cooperative, but the behaviors serve selfish purposes nonetheless, right? So it's in the interest of every individual penguin to engage in this cooperative behavior. Therefore, it is selfish, although it does get expressed as a form of social cooperation. Does everyone follow this? Okay, so when we find cooperation, which you rarely find members of a species that aren't closely related to each other doing much for the rest of them, right? Because you're in competition with them, so you're not going to help them, right? You're going to compete with them. But in cases where you have to, oftentimes where your life is at stake, this does actually happen in nature, okay? Another good example of this is the vampire bat. The vampire bat has an extraordinary behavior. It's best known for one extraordinary behavior, a different one. Of course, they drink the blood of hosts. They're parasites, which is why nobody likes them, right? And they're quite remarkable, too. They, of course, are active at night. They're nocturnal. And people hate them because they carry rabies and infect cattle. This is why we don't like vampire bats. This is a real reason. There's only been one human fatality, I think, in the last 100 years or something that they know of from one, because they don't attack humans, but they attack cattle. The cow is asleep, standing up or down. The vampire bat will fly over to the cow. It'll land on the ground close to where the cow is, not on the cow itself, because it doesn't want to know the cow is there, right? Ambles up to the cow, bites the cow on the foot, usually, because it's on the ground, and begins to drink its blood. Its saliva contains something that numbs the cow, so it's unaware that it's getting bit and having its blood drunk, and it also contains an anticoagulant that prevents the blood from coagulating, which means that the vampire bat can drink as much as it possibly can before it finishes and flies away. Elegant system, love it. So vampire bats, like most small animals, have very high metabolisms, and here is where you find the cooperation between them. If they do not feed for several days, they will die, okay? And what they will do is function as a cooperative insurance policy for each other. So they stay in caves, in groups, during the day. They go out and feed at night. If you and I get back from feeding, and I have not managed to find food, but you have, you will cooperate with me, do me a favor, by vomiting back up some of the blood you've drunk into my mouth. Okay? Isn't that beautiful? And that's how we fell in love. I'll do the same for you. So everybody engages in it. It's what's called reciprocal altruism, but don't worry, we'll get to that when we talk about primates, because primates do this too. It's really only found, this kind of cooperation is found primarily among social species. That's what these two things have in common. That's what primates have in common. And people do the same thing. We cooperate with each other, as well as compete with each other. Okay? But there's a sense in which you sort of have to be forced to cooperate, and you actually see this with human behavior too, right? We sort of have to learn that we need to cooperate with each other. You have to teach a kid this, right? And we're social creatures, to be sure, right? But that competition and that cooperation are balanced and sometimes in conflict with each other. But we are cooperative, which is better than nothing. Okay, mutualism, a type of coevolution where both parties in the relationship benefit. Now we can change to another movie that you might have seen. More of you have probably seen this. That movie is what? Nemo. Although this is a species of clownfish that's a little bit different than Nemo's species, but similar. There's a whole family of them. They all have similar coloration like this. And they all live amongst the tentacles of An enemy. Yeah, right, remember? Yeah, that's it. What's going on here? How do they both benefit? Why do I say this is an example of mutualism, you guys? They're not eggs, they're tentacles. What is an anemone? Why does it protect the clownfish? Let's start there. No. What does the anemone do? Don't you guys know? What's going on? The clownfish live in the anemone. That's the green thing is a living organism. It's like a coral, sort of related to corals. Stings them. Yeah, yeah. Members of the coral and anemone families are known as cnidarians, and they have stinging cells that can actually detach from the body in mucus. So if you rub one, they can sting you, and these stinging cells are extremely painful. Some of them are able to break human skin, actually. There's a species that's kind of popularly known as a hell's fire anemone in Florida that if you walk on the beach and step on, burns the hell out of your foot. It's ugly. But most of them can't break human skin. Nevertheless, other fish avoid them because they're going to get stung by them. The clownfish has evolved the ability to avoid getting stung. And last I read, it hadn't actually been made certain as to how they do this. They do have a thicker mucus layer around them than other fish do, and that might be how they do it. They also may assimilate the stinging cells into their mucus layer and fool the anemone into really thinking that they're part of it. But they just live there, and it protects them, which is good because they're little and bite-sized, remember? Nemo's mother gets eaten by the barracuda. Okay? How does it benefit the anemone? Well, that's an interesting question, and a little bit harder one to figure out. But essentially, there's a number of things that happen. The anemone feeds on detritus, things that flow in the water it captures and consumes. It'll also feed on the feces of the fish, which it needs because it provides nutrients that it needs. It'll also capture living organisms and sting and kill them and eat them, which it does. The fish will swim out into the water and grab things that are floating by and bring them back into the anemone to eat, and they're messy eaters, so the anemone benefits from that. And the other thing the fish do is actually protect the anemone, because there's another fish that actually preys on anemones. It's mostly the family is referred to as a butterfly fish. And they swim over to the base of the anemone, which is sort of vulnerable, and they kind of peck at it until they get it off the rock and they eat it. Well, if one of those tries that with an anemone with a clownfish in it, the clownfish will swim out and bite that other fish and then swim back into the anemone really quick because it doesn't want to get eaten. Clownfish were the worst thing I had to deal with when I was cleaning aquariums. Every time you go in there and they'd think you were threatening their anemone and they'd swim out and bite the shit out of your hand. Especially the big female. The female's bigger. This is the female. The males are smaller. What's that? They have teeth, and they're mean, and they're only like 4 inches long at max, but man, they bite you as hard as they can. I mean, I had one draw blood. They're pretty... What's that? They're horrible like real clowns. Yeah, no, actually they're super cute, and I understand the Nemo craze and everything, but they're going to protect that anemone. They're going to protect their house. They both benefit in a number of other ways, too. It's a really complicated relationship, but kind of a beautiful one. Both of them benefit. Primates have a form of mutualism as seed dispersers. We talked about pollinators. Seed dispersal is pretty much the same thing, except instead of pollen and nectar, what you're going to find with that relationship is seeds and fruit. All primates find the taste of fruit to be good. And the human tendency to eat sweet things and have a sweet tooth comes from this primate tendency, because this is a form of nutrients, like fruit, that you can't get easily in the wild. Okay? It has a lot of vitamins for you and other things that aren't easy to get. Of course, now they're easy to get, so we eat too much sugar. But sugar is something that's not historically been available to us. Primates eat fruit. Primates have color vision. They can see fruit. Trees advertise the availability of the fruit by making it yellow or red against a green background. Oh, look, there it is. Very easy to see. Okay? You can tell when it's ripe and ready. It's all red. So you climb up there and you eat it. Then you swallow pieces of that fruit, including some of the seeds. They pass through your digestion system without breaking down fully because they're in a seed case. And indeed, your digestion may help actually the seed case begin to open. But you'll basically defecate them out the other end, as it were, without them having been destroyed. And that's good for the tree because by that time, you've gone a half a mile away from the tree, and you're going to deposit that seed on the floor of the forest with a little dollop of fertilizer, aka shit. Okay? And that, my friends, is how you, in your evolutionary history, have come to love sweet things and also helped spread the growth of trees. This is a moment you should feel proud. All right. Next form of coevolution is called commensalism. And commensalism is where one partner benefits, but the other has little impact on the other. So there seems to be a neutral effect. Now, no effect will be totally neutral, but sometimes we can't really find much of a positive effect in these relationships, but there's not much harm either. And a good example of this are the two fish that are on the screen now, a remora fish and a black-tip reef shark. Remoras are a very interesting fish. Their modified dorsal fins have evolved to become suckers, which they use to attach themselves to larger fish that they then ride around. They do this with turtles as well. They like sharks a lot because sharks will, of course, give them several advantages. Nobody messes with you when your best friend's a shark, and sharks are really messy eaters too, so they get some food out of it. From as far as we can see, the remora does absolutely nothing for the shark. It doesn't eat parasites off of it. It doesn't have the right-shaped mouth anyway, so it's not even capable of it. It doesn't help the shark, doesn't see things the shark doesn't see, doesn't warn the shark, does not do a damn thing for the shark. It doesn't hurt the shark either, really, except for adding a little bit of drag on it because it's a bit of weight that it's carrying around, but that's pretty negligible. Sharks don't seem to like them. They try to shake them off. But basically, it doesn't do much for the shark. It's pretty neutral for the shark, but it's definitely very positive for the remora. Okay? Remoras were one of my least favorite fish to sell at the fish store. And usually the guys who wanted to have a shark tank would buy them to go with their shark, but there was a problem. Their sharks were too small and the remoras are too big. So you get this weird thing where like the remora would stick to the shark and the shark would be sort of about the same size as the remora, and that was like really weird, but they would still do it. Remoras were really mean too, like meaner than sharks. It was crazy. So if they were about the same size, the remora would beat the shit out of the shark. And I'd have these guys come back after they bought one, and they'd be like, "Hey, dude, this remora like killed my shark." And it's like, "Wow, your shark was really a wimp." So what do you mean, man? That was a great shark. Well, it's dead now, isn't it? Yeah, so, and the worst bit was that they're really fast. One of the reasons they avoid getting eaten is that they'll dart out here and eat and then go back and hook onto the shark. Finally, I hated them because once they stick to something, you cannot get them off. It's impossible. Like the suction cup on their head is so powerful that even if I could get a hold of its tail, if it was stuck to the glass of the aquarium, I could not pull the thing off. It was insanity. People in Polynesia use remora fish to capture turtles for food. You put it. You want to catch a sea turtle in Polynesia for a meal. Here's how you do it. You get yourself a remora. You tie a string to its tail, and you just throw it out in the ocean. And it's going to go straight to something big that it can hook onto. Then you just reel dinner in, right? You better make sure you don't have a shark though, because you could have some trouble there. But then you just whack it when it comes out of the water. So you can literally use them to drag large creatures because that suction cup is so strong. Awful, worst fish ever. Much worse than Nemo. All right, so in reality, what you find is that the relationships between organisms are shifting over the course of time. And a good example of that are these oxpeckers on the ass of this zebra. So an oxpecker's relationship with its hosts fluctuates between mutualism and parasitism. Sometimes they help their hosts, which include not just zebras, but things like rhinos and giraffes, by doing what? What do they do for them? They eat all the parasites that are trying to feed off of them, right? Ticks and all that kind of thing, and they swallow them, and that's great. Both partners benefit. Okay, the cleaners get a meal, the oxpeckers get a meal, and the larger hosts get their parasites removed. But then a funny thing happens one day at work, and the last of the ticks gets eaten by the oxpeckers, and there's nothing left to eat. So what they do is they kind of amble around to the zebra's ears, and they peck a hole in the ear and drink the blood of their host. Okay? So at that point, they've moved from being helpers to being harmers. They've moved from mutualism to parasitism. And that's basically because the world is full of opportunists, is really what it's about. And so relationships between organisms can't always be categorized as one of these things or another because they might actually change over the course of time. Okay? Speaking of time, what do we got, 120? 117, excellent. All right. Now, all of these things illustrate certain things about evolution, but I wouldn't be worth my salt if I didn't show you an example, one of a number of them, as you read in your first set of readings, whereby scientists document evolution actually happening in nature. And this is one of them that was mentioned in your readings. There were several. Talked about sockeye salmon and sticklebacks and also Darwin's finches. This was an early example of evolution getting documented in action, so we'll go briefly through it. That'll be the end of the lecture, and then next time we move on to sex. Woohoo! Okay, so remember the finches are pivotal in Darwin's formulation of natural selection. They've been studied since 1970, which is quite a long time now, by Rosemary and Peter Grant, who are biologists that teach at Princeton University, and their graduate students have done a lot of their work too. There's a book that won a Pulitzer Prize called The Beak of the Finch by Jonathan Weiner, who you read an article by, that's all about their research. Oops, sorry, you don't need to write the part about the Weiner book down, but it's worth reading if you're interested in this subject. Now, the finches have come in about 13 different species on the Galapagos, 11 which are shown here in this phylogeny, which is a fancy word that means family tree. A phylogeny is a little better than a family tree because what it shows is sort of who is most closely related to whom and how much time has passed by since different species have a common ancestor. Those common ancestors are indicated by these points where the tree splits. Okay? So this shows 11 of the 13. The Galapagos is home to 13 species of finch. 11 are shown here. Phylogeny is a family tree that shows ancestor-descendant relationships. I think that's my last point on this one, yeah. And we will look at phylogenies both, well, mainly in the evolutionary part of the class, when we look at macroevolution, all of that toward the end of the class in more detail. The medium ground finch is the species that the Grants researched. Basically, the point here is, and this was mentioned in class and in your text and in the article, that the beaks of Galapagos finches vary according to their diet. The medium ground finch is shown on top here. It's black and has a thick beak. Looks like this. It is called Geospiza fortis. It has a heavy beak that it used to break open seeds. They live in small populations, hundreds of birds on 2 islands in the Galapagos. The Grants measure and catalog every single finch on one island called Daphne Major. There is significant variation amongst the finches. Yes, please stand outside my room and scream. I appreciate it. Okay, so the Grants, basically the interesting thing about the Galapagos Islands is that people didn't really live there, so all the animals are really friendly. And I used to show a documentary of the Grants. They're like really nice old people. And they would sort of be sitting in their camp, and the finches would come and just land on them, right? And they'd feed them. And they would like land on their shoulder. And they all had names. They gave names to all of them, and they would talk to them like they were their old friends, these cute little old people. I just loved it. It was really great. But my students all thought it was boring, so I stopped showing it. Yeah, they have names. All of them have names, and they talk to them. And, you know, Rosemary cries when one of them dies and stuff like that. This is the same slide. I don't know how that happened. Okay, so basically when we look at the finch population over time, what you find is typical, that not all the ground finch chicks survive. Birds who have small beaks, measured as low beak depth, and high beak depth, tend not to survive. Okay? So those that have the highest percentage of survival are those that are in the middle. You can see that here with this histogram. So before selection, meaning this is the number of birds that hatch, you have this distribution. Okay, what they do is they capture and study these finches, do lots of measurements, take blood samples, and all this sort of thing. This is how they did their work. What they found was that the finches that were most likely to survive, those in pink, were those that fell in the middle of this distribution. So if you were really big or really small in your beak size, you were not as likely to survive. Okay? So what we would say is that creates selection pressures against being too big or being too small. Okay? And basically serves to balance out the average size in this environment. Okay? Incidentally, human beings have a similar selection pressure on birth size. So historically, babies that were born too large or too small, tended not to survive, whereas those that were in the middle did. And this would determine what the optimal birth weight is. Okay? We call this stabilizing selection because what it is doing is stabilizing birth weight by virtue of these selection pressures from opposite directions, against large and against small. Okay? Now, what turns out to be the case is that birds with large beaks are capable of cracking certain seeds, either more quickly, or in some cases, they can crack seeds that smaller birds can't crack at all. And that means there's a food resource that's available to them. Okay? The disadvantage is, of course, that larger beaked birds are larger birds, and therefore they need more resources. And this is one of the things that keeps species from getting bigger and bigger, is because it takes more food to get bigger and bigger. Okay? Now, they don't have a lot of predators, so that wasn't a problem. Large size wasn't kept in check by predation, but it was by the resource needs, because Daphne Major is a drought-ridden island that's very dry. Okay? So there's not a lot of precipitation there. Resources are not plentiful. Now, they study them over the course of years, and what they find out is that in the middle of their research, for a little over 18 months, about 20 months, the island is hit by an El Nino drought, and there's no rain at all. And this has a tremendous impact on the population. The finch population crashes. It goes from about 1,200 individuals to about 300, so it was a huge wipeout. Okay? And they studied this and found that certain birds were more likely to survive this wipeout. That is to say that it changed the average size of the bird. Okay? And this is sort of like our example with giraffes, basically. So long-term drought in the Galapagos in the 70s, the drought decreases the food supply. And what they noted, studying the species of plants on the island, is that the tribulus seeds survive the drought disproportionately, because it's a drought-resistant plant, basically. Okay? So what happens is the average beak size or mean beak depth, as it was measured by them, increases dramatically among the group during the drought. This is happening at the same time that the overall population is dropping, but the average beak is getting larger because they're able to feed on these seeds. Okay? So Geospizofortis that can consume tribulus are more likely to survive. This creates a selection pressure for larger beak size. The likely survival, individuals are more likely to survive that are larger. That means that these pink bars shift to the right and the average beak size increases. Okay? Yes?
Do you remember these names, like Chief Lotus and all that?
Did you write it down?
No.
I think I just say medium ground finch on the test. I don't generally make you memorize any scientific names until you get to primates and the material on fossils. So you're fine with this. So how does Geospizofortis demonstrate Darwin's three postulates of natural selection? 1, in the harsh environment of Daphne major, limits the pinch population. Okay. 2, Daphne major population shows beak size variation. Drought favors survival of those with that particular trait. And finally, the mean beak depth increases as offspring of larger beak birds also have large beak birds as babies. Okay. All of this essentially means that the average beak size of the individuals in the group increases over this time. No longer do you have an example of stabilizing selection, but what you have is an example of directional selection. In other words, natural selection is moving the size of the beaks in that particular direction. They are getting larger on average. Okay. The difficulty with seeing evolution in action is that it takes place over long periods of time. Okay. In this case, in order to observe this phenomenon, these people had to study these birds for quite a long period of time, but ultimately they did observe this. Okay. As the article you read by Jonathan Weiner says, there are now hundreds of examples of science that has documented this kind of evolution in action. Some of them are genetic, but that includes some that are not, like this. Right? They're not looking at genetic changes over time. They're looking at actual traits changing over time. Okay? Again, this is a very short-term change, but this is an example of research that looks at evolution actually occurring, the response of an organism to its environment. Okay? Let's go ahead and stop there. That's actually the end of my lecture, and coincides with the zombie look on your face, so I will see you guys on Monday. Talk about sex next week.
Okay, yeah.